Hello, I'm Brigantia Blackbird of Blackbird's Brew. A very late happy Friday, and welcome to the first video in our series, The Pagan Housewife. Now, I had originally planned quite a different topic to cover, something that would have been more practical and less philosophical. However, I had an experience this week that has underscored the deep importance of the matriarch within the home and how she functions within the broader society, and the principles involved are just too important to forego mentioning, particularly about how, the consequences of how women run their households, run their families, how that affects everything else downstream. Now, oddly enough, all of this started coming to my mind when I had to appear for jury duty yesterday. I realize the connection between these two things may not be immediately apparent, but if you'll be kind enough to stick with me, I promise you I will show how it all fits in with the larger picture. And hopefully it'll be a starting point for reflection and also the starting point for a good discussion. So, to begin with, the traditional woman's role, whether we're looking at pagan or non pagan societies, throughout the bulk of human history, women's lives have almost always centered on the home, specifically on the raising of children. Now, the benefit of children being raised by their mothers with some help from, grandma and other adult female relatives is that a sense of self, a sense of family and community, and a sense of culture where you belong is inculcated into the children from a very early age from loving sources. And transmitting values as reflected in cultural norms, religious beliefs, even the system of governance from one generation to the next is a really vital task. One way or another, someone will be teaching the children and telling them who they are, how they ought to live, and what is expected of them. So it's not a question of whether or not this will happen. It's only a matter of who is it who's undertaking this task. And the question that a lot of people are now raising in their minds, is it better for parents, oftentimes mothers, to handle this responsibility? Or is it better just to farm the kids out to the schools? The reality is that whoever ends up raising the child in a day-to-day practical way and successfully teaches that their own preferred value system, that is the person who effectively, and I hate to use this expression, but I couldn't come up with a better one. But this is the person who owns the child. It's not for nothing that we do have the expression, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. I mean, it is simply reflecting a truism that, if we thought about it, really is self-evident. And for the past several decades, women in general have had less and less to do with raising their own children, particularly being in for the day in, day out type of stuff. And that means that the state, often via the school system, is taking on more and more of that role. And this is why we see a lot of teachers' associations and school boards quite arrogantly and publicly declaring that they have the right to decide what the children are and are not taught and what's appropriate or not appropriate. And that the parents really shouldn't be interfering with them. It's not required or even desired to keep the parents informed about what's going on. There is been a transfer of a sense of ownership. Now, thankfully, there is pushback, and parents, notably many enraged mothers, are finally standing up for their children, and they're rethinking the very existence of this system of taxpayer-funded education that's more concerned with ideology that benefits the Democratic Party than it is with teaching actual, relevant, useful information. Now, nothing can relieve a parent of their responsibilities towards their children, and the division between fathers and mothers, with fathers traditionally providing and protecting, and mothers traditionally nurturing and teaching, is something that has evolved naturally. That's why we see the same basic pattern in most of human history and most societies, regardless of where you're living, your language, your culture, your religion, how you're governed. We generally see this being the way it generally flows. And through the efforts of both parents attending their duties, whatever that division of labor ends up being, the children had a much better chance of being taken care of both physically and psychologically. And it really took the arrogance of our modern era to call this pattern into question. And the consequences of this and rejecting, what the rest of human history knew up until yesterday, this can now be seen in multiple generations. I would say probably beginning with the baby boomers and then you Gen Xers, the millennials, of which I am shamefully a part, and everyone who goes forward. You're seeing more and more of this degradation of people who don't know who they are, why they are, what they're doing. Well, it's because you weren't raised by your mom. Now were you? I think it isn't a coincidence that because of this general degeneration of our society, that more and more people are seeing the state itself as some kind of authority figure, rather than just an organization that's been deputized by the people to attend to certain matters. It isn't a coincidence that we are seeing more people act like subjects of the government rather than citizens of our country. And it isn't a coincidence that this is all taking place in a time period in which fewer and fewer women are raising their children. It means that culture is not being transmitted. Standards, values, beliefs aren't being transmitted, which is quite dangerous because despite what some might say, America does have a culture. It's a culture that is essentially articulated in the Declaration of Independence, in the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. But it's something that has to be practiced among ourselves in order for it to have any real force. This isn't merely a question of legalities and what you can get away with in a courtroom, but this reflects the manner in which we believe it is fit for human beings to live and how we treat and interact with each other. It's about how we hold organizations accountable, whether it's the government or a company or a religion. Our culture of self-determination and having the respect of other peoples to also determine their lives for themselves and rejecting the culture of not worshiping the state and not worshiping the government as some kind of moral authority. This can only be achieved within the family setting. And of course, mom and dad are going to play a big role in that, but mom especially will. Now, the school system, especially right now, is preaching the exact opposite. That's why we see young people who are rejecting our founding documents. They're rejecting American ideals. They're embracing collectivism of various types, and they're rejecting morality and even objective reality in its totality. It's because no one is raising them. No one who really takes care of them is raising them. So the kids are now in the midst of a absolutely horrific identity crisis in which nothing about life or even themselves is certain, and this increases their inherent vulnerability. It makes it more likely that other people can take advantage of them. Especially when these kids have been persuaded that their parents are people who don't really have their interest at heart, or they don't understand them, or they're trying to keep something good from them. The children then look to other authority figures. Never forget, nature abhors a vacuum. Children look to adults. So if they're trained to stop looking towards their parents, they will start looking towards someone else. And this is usually teachers or celebrities, even politicians now. And these are people who are all too happy to use them for their own ends, with the politicians and activist teachers being the most guilty. It is absolutely vital for parents to reclaim their authority and to protect their children from these ideological predators. Mothers, in particular, have a very unique role to play in inoculating their children from the rampant brainwashing we see taking place in the school system and the consequences it has in the broader world. Now, you might be asking, how on earth is any of this related to jury duty? Well, this is where we get into it. It has been said, honestly, that politics are downstream from culture. Therefore, the law and how and when it is enforced is also downstream from our culture. Now, for most people, our participation in the system and influencing it and how it functions will take place at the ballot box or when we're called up for jury duty. Now, I admit, I wasn't thrilled when I was called up, but after I was sitting through the selection process, despite the fact that I wasn't ultimately chosen, I have had a shift in my thinking and in my attitude on this matter. And this is all owing to what I was witnessing during the selection process itself. It just became so crystal clear in my mind that the reactions of every participant, from the potential jurors to court officials to the lawyers, it was all in consequence and a reflection of what these people believed about the system itself. And those beliefs, of course, are shaped by the culture. And that means what we were taught, whether it was from someone outside of our family or someone within our family. So here's what happened. After all the potential jurors got checked in with the clerk, we were eventually brought into the courtroom. I had expected to feel a bit intimidated by my surroundings just because of the setting and what we were there to do and the seriousness of the occasion. But surprisingly, I felt less intimidated than I expected to be. Maybe it was because no one had tried to hassle anyone about masks. Maybe it was just the energy of the people in the room. But regardless, I did feel more comfortable than I had expected. Now, what happened next was that there were a lot of flowery words from the judge thanking everyone for coming, underscoring how important it is and the rationale for the nature of questions that we might be asked. We were told that it was a criminal case, and we were kind of given a vague notion of the charges. Then we were all sworn in, and then the lawyers got to take a crack at us, with the prosecutor going first. So the first thing he wanted to know was if anyone in the jury knew each other or anyone else in the court. And as it happens, a few people were acquainted, which, wasn't all that astonishing. It's not that highly populated of a county, and, that isn't that big of a town, to be honest. So it's pretty natural that people would have at least crossed paths. But they were also asked if that would affect how they viewed the evidence, if they would feel pressured in any way, if they thought someone might, effectively bully them into going along with the conclusion instead of making up their own minds. Could they be brutally honest with each other? Everyone said they would, and I'd like to point out this was mostly women. But that's just not a statement I would be prepared to take at face value, specifically because so many of the women were saying, oh, yes, I could be honest with this person no matter what. I call bullshit. I recently lost two good friends because of honesty, and it wasn't even brutal honesty like what you would be expected to have in jury deliberations. This is just flat out, call a spade kind of honesty. I think the reality that most of us dance around and choose not to acknowledge is that most people are only honest with each other up to a certain point. And within female relationships, that's even more so the case. We are constantly tiptoeing around each other, around feelings, around all this crap. Now, I don't know what the attorneys thought of these responses, but it's because the women actually said, oh, yes, I can be honest with them no matter what. It made me less inclined to trust their judgment or to believe what they would say or to give their judgment any credence, because either they're being dishonest with the prosecutor or they're being dishonest with themselves. So either way. That I didn't think that was a real good start. But after that, things actually got a little bit spicy. The prosecutor asked us if anyone present thought that all drugs should be legalized. Hands did go up. Mine was included in that. We were asked why we thought that. My argument is essentially that the state has no role to play in what adults are or do or do not take into their bodies, what should be allowed for any reasons. We're adults. If we want to take risks, if we want to be self-destructive, that is essentially our prerogative. Now, if we were to inflict harm upon another person or commit a theft or damage property, then the government has something at stake, and it does have an actual role to play, and it does have some business there, but it isn't the role of the government to tell anyone how to live. It's there to maintain public order and really nothing else. So I'm pretty sure that this was the moment when the prosecutor decided to strike me from the jury. His follow-up question was if I could vote to convict on the basis of a law that I disagreed with. I said that it really depended on whether or not that law was constitutional, and if it isn't constitutional, the law has no validity. The prosecutor then looked just a teensy bit worried and asked if anyone else felt the same. If they would need to judge the validity of the law before determining a verdict. Now, to several people's credit, and I want to give them full props for this, they did raise their hands, they presented their case, some of them had similar objections to mine, others had a slightly different take, but I couldn't help but notice that none of us who vocalized these objections were ultimately selected for the jury. I think that's very telling, and it's very disturbing on several levels, most of which because the prosecutor clearly did not want the jury to examine whether or not the law was valid and constitutionally compliant. And the questions going forward from that point seem to be more and more focused on boxing the jury in with instructions and saying they have to adhere to them. That isn't really true, is it? Jury nullification is a thing, even in the state of Missouri, much to the dismay of many judges and prosecutors. And, like it or not, it absolutely is the role of the jury to see that justice is done, and sometimes that involves saying, this law has no business existing, therefore we are definitely not convicting on the basis of that. This is part of the checks and balances of our system, and it's one that, people in authority, these institutionalists, do not want us to exercise. And it's a reminder to these people in these institutions that the proper position of government is that of servant, not ruler. It is we, the people, who are the sovereigns. The government is merely deputized to carry out certain duties, but they are not the ones who are responsible for setting the tone. That's up to us. And the Constitution is the measuring stick we compare laws to. And we have the absolute right to abolish those laws at any time. And part of that includes not punishing defendants for allegedly breaking laws that should never have been implemented to begin with. It's just that way. Now, because the prosecutor clearly wanted to avoid any examination of the law in question, I started asking myself some questions. Is this law obviously violating the Constitution? Does the prosecution just have a weak case? Why does the prosecutor want to gaslight the jury into thinking that they have no real power and no real choice in this situation? I didn't like it, wasn't a fan. The other major question he asked was whether or not anyone had doubts about law enforcement generally. Up several hands went, and when I was asked, I said that my doubts about the law enforcement stemmed from the unconstitutional enforcement of COVID-related edicts and mandates. I said it was their duty to have arrested the responsible politicians, but instead the police supported the politicians and turned on the taxpayers who are their employers. Law enforcement takes an oath to uphold the Constitution, but their actions showed that those were just empty words. So the prosecutor then asked if that meant that anyone in law enforcement who might testify would have a mark against them from the start. I said that they would be on the same level as any other public official, and I compared them to politicians. That got the message across. After all, if I wasn't going to be selected for the jury anyway, and I knew I wasn't at that point, I might as well go for broke. But I said that the actions of law enforcement and their willingness to infringe on people's rights and betray their oaths, it brought the entire profession into disrepute, because the citizenry at that point has no reason to trust that these institutions or those within them are acting in good faith or within the constitutionally authorized scope of their authority, and I think it's worthwhile saying that out loud. After a while, the defense attorney then got to ask his questions, which were more of a nothing burger. I think the issues that had already been brought up by myself and by other people there laid a good bit of the groundwork that the defense probably would have wished for. Even though the majority of the potential jurors just sat, silently like, little bumps on a log, once issues are raised, there is no unhearing them. Judges can say, oh, you need to disregard this or that, but let's be real. Once something has entered your mind isn't going to just discount that because someone else told you to. It's going to factor in some way, somehow. And of course, that can affect how people perceive what's going on to begin with, what they think about it, and how they will ultimately rule on the issue. So during this process, I saw signs of, there were some free thinkers amongst us. There were some, rather pathetic institutionalists. There were a lot of NPCs, and there were a lot of question marks. The questions that we were asked, I think that had less to do with ensuring a fair trial and more to do with the attorney's attempt to stack the deck. Now, this is to be expected. Both sides are trying to win, and I'm not so naive as to believe that those who operate in our civil institutions do so with a pure heart because they have high ideals of justice and just want the right thing to be done, whatever that outcome is. Please. This isn't Pollyanna. We don't live in that kind of world. But the way people answered the questions, and those who didn't speak up at all, and there were quite a few, that's very telling to me. There were a handful of people who did vocalize objections, and that indicated to me that they're not the sort of people who just take what they're told at face value. They're going to think about it. They're going to make up their own minds. They're going to want to have a more complete picture, and they're not just going to take someone's word for it. Now, those who remain silent, can't really tell what's going on there. Perhaps they were thinking what others had the courage to actually say out loud. Maybe they weren't listening. That's another possibility. Or maybe they were the sort of people who are going to believe whatever they're told to believe by whomever they perceive to be an authority. You just don't know. It's a wild card. And I don't know if that was ultimately good or bad for the defendant. I don't know how that trial went. I've been looking since then for a little information about the outcome, but I haven't come across it yet. But since being released, at least for this particular trial, because in Missouri, potential jurors, we have a term of service, and mine doesn't end until March 31st, 2022. I might be called to appear again, but for now, I'm off the hook. But I've been doing a good bit of thinking, and it's actually why this video is coming out so late today. And I got thinking about how we're guaranteed to a trial by a jury of our peers. But what is a peer? People who blindly trust the system or who will submit to the system even if they believe it's wrong, those aren't my peers. People who don't speak up when the time comes to speak, they're not my peers. People who are chosen just because the attorneys get the feeling that their personal biases will make them lean their way, those are not my peers. This has brought up serious questions about our legal system, and I don't think there are any easy answers. But more than anything, in bringing up this experience, because again, this is all in consequence of what people believe, how everyone reacting, it was a mirror reflection of what they believe. More than anything else, I bring this up because I'm wanting to make an appeal to my fellow pagans, particularly the women, to stand up and to be a part of actively shaping the evolution of our society and its culture, and by extension, the laws we'll end up having to deal with. Now, a lot of people are afraid, and not without just cause, to stand up for themselves and to stand up for their children, and they're afraid to stand up for the rights of the community in general. They're afraid to look at these institutions and tell them no. And this is thanks to the past few years. I mean, when it's gotten really intense. Our society's been on a really bad track for quite a while through multiple generations. But in the past 5 years, it's gotten really bad. We have obvious examples of political persecution. We have cancel culture, thanks to big tech. People are increasingly convinced that they're going to be punished if they don't go along with the crowd, and that the consequences could be dire. And it isn't just social isolation, that can be harsh enough for the average person. But it's also the fear that people will lose their employment, or that their children or their spouses will suffer in some way, or they could potentially even lose custody of their children. There's actually been people who've been having to fight that because one parent thinks one thing about the vaccine and the parent thinks a different thing about the vaccine. People have a lot at stake here, or that some people are afraid that their opinions might serve as an excuse for the state to prosecute them, and they might have to go through a legal nightmare or even end up in prison. Because the authoritarians amongst us have made it very clear that they have no problem ruling through fear. And there's absolutely no limit to how far they'll go. So lying about people, demonizing them publicly, misrepresenting them, going after them with the law, even when there's no cause. And, as a result, many people have just ducked their heads and bent the knee. It's because they're afraid. And because deep down, a lot of people have the very false belief that if they just comply and do as they're told, that there will somehow be a limit to the tyranny they're subjected to, or that they and their families will be spared the worst of it. It's cowardice. Yeah, I know that sounds harsh, but it is cowardice. It's time to speak frankly amongst ourselves. And this is the horrible and uncomfortable reality. The more someone has to lose, the greater they have the duty to speak up. Hiding behind, but what about my job or my business, or I can't put my spouse or my children through this. It's an excuse. It is an excuse. It's an evasion of duty. You are supposed to defend yourself. You're supposed to defend your family, your community, and your nation. And to fail to do that when the time comes, to fail to even speak up for fear someone might think less of you, it's a betrayal of the values people are claiming to cherish. And the longer you wait to speak up, the harder it's going to be, and the more you're likely to lose. You gain courage through creating a pattern of speaking up, and you start by doing it when it's uncomfortable. Then it's when you might actually be punished or penalized in some way. You are not going to be able to stand up when it really matters and when it really counts if you didn't start standing up when things were small. And also think about the legacy we've been left from the Founding Fathers. They had everything to lose: homes, land, businesses, financial assets, marriages, children, and most definitely their lives. They had every excuse in the world to retreat from the conflict that was theirs to fight. Or fast forward in time to the Civil War. You can't tell me that people weren't risking it all in the effort to free the slaves. They did it not because they didn't think anything would happen to them. They did it because they knew it was a necessary risk to take, that our civilization simply could not go on with the institution of slavery, point blank. Or what about World War II? Did people not risk it all to stop the Nazis? Did they not understand they could be sacrificing a great deal to fight that? They knew. They showed courage anyway. Or what about, more recently during the civil rights era? Do any of us seriously imagine that those who marched and advocated for equality before the law, people who believed in Dr. King's dream that we should be judging by the content of character and rather than the color of the skin, do we really think they didn't experience hardships and harassment, or that their families didn't suffer, or that they didn't have professional difficulties? Of course they did. Every generation that rises to meet a major conflict makes sacrifices. That is duty. I know that's not a comfortable word. In our culture, we like to talk about rights. We like to talk about self-determination. We like to talk about what we want. We're not as good about talking about duty. But in order to have that self-determination and the rights that we are, frankly, by human nature entitled to have, that requires taking on the responsibility and the duty to defend it, even if it costs us, even if we are ultimately casualties in that fight. That is our obligation. Because the time has come for our generation to take on that mantle and to attempt to restore the Republic, as well as to try to preserve and pass down American culture. Yes, it's scary. Yes, it involves risk. Yes, we may find ourselves suffering injustice, and we might see people we love suffering because of our actions as well, or rather to the reaction of others to our actions. But none of that, none of the anxiety, the fear, or the risk relieves us of our duty to take a stand. Why should someone defend us if we're not willing to defend ourselves? Why is it okay to expect someone else to take risks on our behalf and then just sit back and wait to reap the rewards? Why should someone else be a sacrificial animal for our freedom? Because that's the mentality we're all having to fight off. The idea that someone else should do it, that we shouldn't have to be inconvenienced. We shouldn't have to make a sacrifice. Ugh. What low character we have, and how hard it is going to be to build ourselves back up. But think about this. If our generation fails, what example does that set for the next? And this is why I'm also addressing mothers in particular. Raising children who are going to stand up for their beliefs really begins with the culture, the standards, and the expectations within the home. If mom and dad are seen standing up for themselves, for each other, the family, and the things they care about, it's much more likely that the children will find their own courage when they need it. This is where the women, particularly the mothers in our societies, have such a huge role to play. Women tend to be the people who define the standards, who make the rules. If mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. Happy wife, happy life. These expressions are truisms because we live the reality of it every single day. Women wield an astonishing amount of power. So if we want to protect ourselves, if we want to protect our loved ones and what's important to us in our lives, then let's use that power and teach the value of courage and of taking actions. Women are the makers of people and the shapers of culture. Let's use it. And this means setting a good example of taking the risks ourselves and making it clear that the unwanted consequences we might face are not as important as our principles, that there are things worth suffering for, and that we are doing it so that the people we love can have a better time of it than what we will have. And people get so caught up worrying about what might happen if they do stand up, that they completely lose sight of the consequences of what happens if they don't. So I would ask the mothers who might see this video to think about the long-term good of their children. Your kids are going to learn from you, and right now they need to see you demonstrate courage to live it. You have the power to help turn the tide and to improve how the future is shaped. So don't abandon that task out of fear. So, thank you for staying to the end of this and for hearing me out. The times we're living in are not easy for anyone, and all of us have a great deal to lose. I think it's fair to say that most people are scared, and most people don't want to have to be brave because most people just want to be left alone and not have to fool with any of it. But we're living in a time that requires us to be brave, and there are many opportunities to show some backbone. It doesn't have to be some big overarching dramatic event. It just needs for us to say no and say, I'm not going along with this crowd. And this can be done whether it's in the way that you are raising your children, or by speaking up in a courtroom insisting on constitutional standards, or by speaking publicly and advocating for needed reform. Just don't back down from the fight. Don't back down from the battle that was meant for you to fight in. Be brave and be one of the people who's working to create a better future. So, if you would like to discuss this further, I would be very happy to see you at Blackbird's Brew on Discord. There's a link to join in the description box below. In the meantime, however, please subscribe to this channel, like this video, leave a comment. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.